The world's largest democracy and the world's largest economy are about to sign their most consequential trade agreement in over a decade. 4 years of negotiations, 6 rounds of talks, 2 governments and 1 Supreme Court ruling later, the final text is being written in Delhi this week. Most Indians have not been told exactly what is in it and what it changes for them. So today, let us walk through it line by line.
You're listening to Nelson John 360. Nelson John 360.
Hello, and welcome back to the Nelson John 360 podcast. I'm your host, Nelson John. All right, before we get into what is being signed this week, it helps to take 3 steps back because, the road to here has been bumpy. The story, it really begins in February 2025 when the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met President Donald Trump in Washington. They walked out with something called Mission 500, a stated ambition to more than double bilateral trade in goods and services from around $210 billion in 2024 to $500 billion by the year 2030. That is the target. The mechanics of getting there was left to the negotiators. Talks on a bilateral trade agreement formally opened next month in March 2025. But trade deals, they don't exist in a vacuum. And a few weeks later, on the 2nd of April, the Trump administration declared what it called Liberation Day, a 10% baseline tariff on most countries, with higher reciprocal tariffs on those Washington described as having unfair barriers. India was on that higher list. By August, things had escalated. India was sitting under a combined 50% tariff, 25% reciprocal, and an additional 25% penalty due to what the White House said was a response to India's continued purchases of Russian crude. White House trade advisor Peter Navarro described the war in Ukraine in one widely reported phrase as Modi's war. The language was sharp. The economic impact was sharper. Textile exporters in Tirupur and Ludhiana reported up to 50% drop in turnover. Diamond polishers in Surat went home early. Leather units in Kanpur asked Gulf and European retailers to absorb shipments. Marine exporters in Andhra Pradesh and Kerala saw orders go on hold. Pharma and electronics, by some grace of supply chain dependency, were largely exempted under Section 232. 6 rounds of talks followed, some in Delhi, some in Washington, some virtual. The negotiators reportedly came close several times. Each time, agriculture and dairy held the deal up. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman called agriculture and dairy a big red line in an interview to the Financial Express last year. Goel in Switzerland in June said he was born optimist. Then on the 3rd of February 2026, almost exactly 4 months ago, Trump and Modi unveiled a framework agreement. Now, here's what landed in February. In the version of the deal that exists today as an interim framework, the 50% combined tariff was reduced to an 18% baseline for most affected Indian exports. That 18% now applies to textiles, apparels, leather, footwear, home decor, and a basket of artisanal products that include handloom and handicraft goods. 18%, it's still high, but to put that in context, Goel noted that India now enjoys a lower tariff to the US market than its neighbors, including China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. For an exporter in Tirupur deciding whether to bid for the next season's orders against competitors in Dhaka, that gap really matters. A specific list of Indian agricultural products got zero duty access. Spices, tea, coffee, cashew, chestnuts. Tropical fruits like avocado, banana, mango, kiwi, papaya. That zero duty ban is a meaningful win for agricultural exporters in Karnataka, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Maharashtra. And importantly, what was protected? Goel told the Rajya Sabha that maize, wheat, rice, sugar, Soybean and poultry were kept outside of tariff concessions. Dairy was kept out. Fertilizer was kept out. The Agriculture Minister, Mr. Shivraj Singh Chauhan, repeated this same line. Farmers' interests, he said, are non-negotiable. That is the position the government has held in public. The opposition, however, has questioned a different phrase in the joint statement. A sentence that says India has agreed to address long-standing non-tariff barriers to trade in U.S. food and agriculture products. Congress's Jairam Ramesh argues that the phrasing was, in his words, far too open-ended. Let me come back to that. Now, which brings us to this week is on the 1st of June, ahead of a fresh round of talks, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal addressed reporters in Delhi. He said the leaders of both nations had already announced this framework on the 3rd of February. And he said in a phrase that was widely picked up, all major points have been settled. All major points have been settled, yes. The US team, some members have already arrived, others are arriving tonight. Our meetings are scheduled for the 2nd of June, 3rd, and the 4th. That is the negotiating window that opened today, as I record. 3 days. The work is to take the February framework and translate it into a formal text, a signed first tranche of the bilateral trade agreement. The headline items on that text are tariff structures, market access, customs facilitation, and investment-related measures. There is also a separate complication that the negotiators need to handle. Earlier this year, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down a set of tariffs Trump had imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA. The court ruled that the act did not grant the president the authority to impose tariffs in that manner, and that such powers properly rest with Congress. Practically, you see, this means the legal scaffolding under some of the earlier tariffs actions, they've been removed. The Indian side has indicated that the new agreement will reflect those legal changes, which is to say, the deal will be written in a way that survives a US court challenge. Goyal said as much on Monday. Now, if the next 3 days go ahead as planned, the joint statement and the formal text are expected to be finalized in days, not weeks. Now, let's talk about numbers. Let me put the trade itself in some perspective. Bilateral trade between India and the United States in financial year 2024 to 25 stood at $131.84 billion. Indian exports to the US, $86.5 billion. Imports from the US, $45.3 billion. India's trade surplus with the US in that year, roughly $41 billion. The US has been India's largest trading partner for 4 years running. India ranked 10th on the US side. On tariffs, India's average applied tariff sits at around 17%. The US figure is 3.3. On agriculture, the gap is wider still. India's average applied agriculture tariff is 39% against 5% on the US side. Those are the numbers that drive much of the friction. Mission 500 again targets $500 billion by 2030. The math here is not trivial. To get from $132 billion to $500 billion in 5 years, you see, the trade needs to compound at roughly 30% a year. That will not happen at the headline level, but it could happen at the cluster level, say in pharma, in textiles, electronics, in services. Every trade agreement has 2 columns. The concession India receives are one column. The commitments India make are the other. So what's in column 2? First, India has agreed to address what the joint statement calls long-standing non-tariff barriers on U.S. food and agricultural products. The specifics here, well, they're contested. The government's position is that this does not mean opening up dairy, GM foods, or sensitive grains. Critics, however, they argue that the language is broader than the disclaimers. Second, India has committed to increased purchases of U.S. energy. In the run-up to this week's talks, Indian public sector oil companies, Indian Oil, Bharat Petroleum, and Hindustan Petroleum, they've all signed a first-of-its-kind deal to purchase liquefied petroleum gas from the United States. You see, that is significant. The US has been pushing India to diversify away from Russian crude for over a year. Third, India agreed to streamline customs procedures, address investor confidence concerns, and back broader supply chain partnerships. And then there is the most contested item: distillers' dried grains with solubles, or DDGS, which is a corn-based animal feed byproduct. Under the framework, India will allow DDGS imports under a quota. The government has clarified that imports will be GM-free post-processing. Farmer groups, including the Alliance for Sustainable and Holistic Agriculture and the Congress, have raised concerns that DDGS is in effect derived from genetically modified American corn, and that allowing it could compete with domestic soybean meal and hurt soybean farmers in Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan. The PIB, which is the Press Information Bureau's fact-check unit, pushed back on viral videos last week claiming the deal harms farmers. Its position is that no sensitive sector has been opened up. The reading of the joint statement, however, will be debated long after the document is signed. Now, if you are mapping who stands to benefit, here's the rough picture as it looks today. Indian textile clusters, the ones in Tirupur, Surat, Ludhiana, Bhilwara, they likely take the largest immediate upside. 18% is a tariff they can work with. 50%? No chance. Gems and jewelry anchored in the Bharat Diamond Bourse in Mumbai and in Surat's polishing units, they regain a competitive runway against Antwerp and Tel Aviv. Indian generic pharmaceutical exporters, they supply roughly 70% of essential drugs used in the United States, according to industry data, continue to operate largely tariff-free. The strategic logic for that is supply chain dependency, the kind the US discovered the hard way during COVID. Agricultural exports of spices, tea, coffee, mango, cashew nuts, and the tropical fruits list. Quietly, one of the biggest beneficiaries. Many of these are MSMEs operating out of the southern and western states. Electronic manufacturers, particularly assembly operations under the production-linked incentive scheme, benefit from the China Plus One strategy that U.S. firms are increasingly building into their supply chains. Also, areas to watch carefully would be soybean farmers, if DDGS imports scales faster than the government anticipates. Dairy, where the formal language is protective, but the underlying pressure remains. And services and digital trade, where India and the US have not yet found common ground, and which will likely dominate the second trench. Now, let's step back from the 18% and the joint statements. And you see a larger pattern. A larger pattern is visible. American supply chains are reorienting away from a single country dependency on China. India, with its scale and demographics, is one of a handful of countries positioned to absorb that shift. The pharma exemption, the electronics exemption, the textile rate cut, these are not random. They map onto sectors where the US needs alternatives. And on the Indian side, this trade deal sits next to other moving pieces. The H-1B visa landscape, it's harder than it has been in years. Appointment slots at Indian consulates have been pushed to 2027. A new $100,000 fee on H-1B applications is being absorbed by industry. The reverse flipping of Indian startups, Grow, Meesho, Reshape, moving headquarters back from Delaware and Singapore to India, is partly a response to this changed environment. All of which is to say, the trade deal is one strand in a much larger weaving. India and the United States are recalibrating what they are to each other, economically, technologically, and strategically. Some strands are growing tighter, others are being cut and retied. Back to where we opened, the world's largest democracy and the world's largest economy. 4 years of negotiations, 6 rounds of talks, two governments and one Supreme Court ruling that quietly reshaped the legal architecture this deal had to be written under. And at the end of it all, a document being finalized in Delhi this week that most Indians have not yet been told exactly what is in. At the start, as I promised to walk through it line by line, this is what we've done. 18% on the tariff side, zero duty on the spices, the tea, the mangoes, maize, wheat, rice, sugar, soybean, poultry, dairy, held. DDGS, contested. Energy purchases, well, moving. Services and digital trade, push to the next tranche. What gets signed in Delhi over these 3 days is not the end of the story. It's the first chapter. The second tranche is where the hard questions live. Agriculture in its broader form, services, digital trade, and the long-standing non-tariff barrier language that both sides will read differently the first time it is tested. So whatever the Mission 500 ends up looking like in 2030 will be built on one document, one disputed clause, one quietly negotiated quota at a time. This was the Nelson John 360 podcast. Thank you for joining me here today. Do leave your thoughts, your opinions, your feedbacks on Instagram. You can reach out to me on Instagram at @NelsonJohn360. I'd love to hear from you all. I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, stay sharp, stay informed.